So I assume most people watching this video know what the keto diet is. In short, the idea is you limit carbohydrates to very small amounts, less than 10% of calories, until you enter something called ketosis, which is measured by the rise in what are called ketones in your blood. Many people have had success on a keto diet. I have lost 30 pounds or more at least 3 times in my life on a keto diet. And so there is a lot of evidence that a keto diet can help people lose weight. I stole this chart from Denise Minger's In Defense of Low Fat. She's pointing out that these very low fat diets have some type of magic when it comes to weight loss and metabolic health, and that these keto diets up here, which are more than 65% of calories are from fat. So these are keto diets, and these work by some other type of magic. And in the middle, and this is perhaps my favorite part of this graph, is what she calls the macronutrient swampland. So, we want to test this, and there's one great recent experiment led by Kevin Hall that does exactly that. And this is exactly the study that we want. You can see in the low carb diet, 10% of calories are from carbs, 75% of calories are from fat. And in the low fat diet, those things are exactly reversed. Of course, one of the rationales for low carb diets is they reduce insulin signaling. They look at postprandial insulin. People on the low carb diet do not have a huge insulin spike from the meal. When you look at fasting insulin in the morning after the low carb diet, or interestingly, the low fat diet, both groups of people had significant reductions in their fasting insulin levels, and they both reduced fasting blood glucose by a pretty similar amount. What is very interesting in this table, and is very important, and we're going to focus on for the rest of the video, are the free fatty acids. So these are the fats that are released by your adipose tissues, by your fat tissues, and those are fats that circulate around in your blood, and they are available for your cells to take up and use as fuel at any moment. And you can see at baseline, that number was 328. Insulin suppresses the release of free fatty acids. And so on the low carb diet, you see more than doubling of free fatty acids from a fasting state. One thing I've been talking a lot about recently is elevated branched chain amino acids. So elevated branched chain amino acids are an indicator of insulin resistance. And you can see on the low carb diet compared to the baseline before people started the diet, all of the branched chain amino acids are significantly increased on the low carb ketogenic diet. I'm not bringing this up to bang on the low carb diet. You can see on the low carb diet, people have significantly higher baseline free fatty acids, right? And so they're not going to be able to efficiently burn glucose. That would be our prediction. Also, and so what happened here is at time 0, they take an oral glucose tolerance test. And so they suck down a liquid glucose solution. For the people on the low carb diet are much more insulin resistant, and people who are supporters of the ketogenic diet would say they're glucose sparing, right? They haven't been eating any glucose, so of course they're not particularly set up to use glucose. This all makes sense. I'm not saying it's pathology or it's bad in this context. We're going to look at the keto magic. This is bacon magic, and this is indeed a whole different kind of magic. They couldn't be more opposite. I think you'll see that. So the first question is, what is ketogenesis? Why do we do it? What causes it? Why does reducing carbohydrates cause ketogenesis? This paper is a 1982 paper, and they point out that Leninger proposed that the availability of oxaloacetate for citrate synthase represents the major regulatory factor in ketogenesis. You probably don't know what that means, but we're going to explain it. They do a bunch of experiments, and their data strongly supports this classical view that ketogenesis is essentially controlled by oxaloacetate concentration. Okay, but let's step through how this ketosis works. So ketosis activates PPAR alpha, and PPAR alpha upregulates CD36 and CPT1, which are those enzymes that are importing fat into the cell and then into the mitochondria, especially in the liver. Here's that drawing I did again. You can see the PPAR alpha increasing the two transport enzymes, and these fats are getting mainlined into the mitochondria. Beta oxidation, which is Now, beta oxidation is the process of breaking down fats into those acetyl-CoA groups that then enter the Krebs cycle to be burned for ATP. And this is the cycle of beta oxidation. And so at this step of beta oxidation, we convert NAD plus to NADH. This table is from that paper talking about oxaloacetate being the limiting factor in ketosis. What they do is they extract rat liver cells and they give them different amount of oleate, which is oleic acid, which is essentially olive oil. And you can see that the more fat that they give the cells, the higher total ketone production goes. Beta hydroxybutyrate is the most common ketone. It's probably the one that your ketone meter reads. It's the one that most people have heard of. Acetoacetate is kind of the other ketone. And what you can see is that at low levels of ketone body production, they're both going up. And then once you get to a higher level of fat in these cells, beta hydroxybutyrate continues to rise and acetoacetate starts to drop. And what is extraordinarily interesting about the ratio of, beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate is that converting acetoacetate to beta hydroxybutyrate requires an NADH, and it gives you an NAD plus back. As NADH levels in cells rise, more acetoacetate is converted to beta hydroxybutyrate. This winds up being a really interesting trick because this ratio tells us how reduced the NAD pool in the mitochondria is. Now, this is from the Kevin Hall paper again. And it just so happens they actually report acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate levels between the low carb and the low fat diet. In my opinion, they're not doing this to show us mitochondrial redox balance. They're just doing it to try to be thorough because those are two types of ketones that can be produced. The more NADH there is, the more BHB there is. So if your goal is to have a lot of NAD plus, you want a low number. On this low carb ketogenic diet, it's definitely working. Beta hydroxybutyrate goes from 0.089 at baseline to 2. So that's an increase of more than 20-fold in overall ketone production. But what also happens is the ratio of beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate goes from 2.5 to 4.7. That's a near doubling of the ratio of NADH to NAD+. And so that low carb ketogenic diet is lowering NAD+ availability for sure. And so the ketogenic diet increases the NADH levels relative to NAD+. And the low-fat diet does exactly the opposite. And so that's why I was saying these are very different magics. Now we're up to step 3. The reason that we make ketones is that we run out of oxaloacetate. This is the reason that happens. So again, here we are in the Krebs cycle. We need NAD plus to convert malate to oxaloacetate. The fact that we're breaking down all of this fat into acetyl-CoA groups because PPAR alpha is shoveling fat into the mitochondria means that there's not much NAD plus available, right? We can't do this conversion. We've run out of NAD plus to do that conversion. And so oxaloacetate levels are going to go down and malate levels are going to go up because we simply can't do this conversion with high NADH levels. This is from that paper talking about oxaloacetate limitation produces ketones. And you can see the more fat that they give the cells, the higher malate levels go. They go from 750 all the way up to over 1500. So malate levels double. Conversely, oxaloacetate levels go from 1.9 down to 0.4. The Krebs cycle is getting stuck at malate. It's not advancing to oxaloacetate. And oxaloacetate is becoming a limiting factor. Why is the lack of oxaloacetate such a problem? Well, if we look again at the top of the Krebs cycle, here's what is required to use the TCA cycle to generate ATP. That fat is being broken down into acetyl-CoA. For the acetyl-CoA to get oxidized in the Krebs cycle, it has to combine with oxaloacetate to become citrate. Now, if you're consuming carbohydrates, they get converted to pyruvate, and that pyruvate can be used to create oxaloacetate. If there's no pyruvate in your diet, or if there's no glucose in your diet, you can't get any pyruvate. Fat is coming in as acetyl-CoA, and it's going around the cycle, and it's getting stuck, and it's not getting converted to oxaloacetate. So the next acetyl-CoA that comes in, it's just hanging out. It's got nowhere to go, right? The acetyl-CoA needs oxaloacetate to get burned in the Krebs cycle. Oxaloacetate can also be used for gluconeogenesis, and that means making blood glucose. Not only is the high NADH to NAD plus ratio inhibiting the conversion of malate to oxaloacetate in the liver is going to prioritize gluconeogenesis, because the liver needs to make some blood sugar because you're not consuming glucose, right? And so the oxaloacetate that's there is going to get shunted into gluconeogenesis. And so that is also going to decrease the oxaloacetate level in the liver. And people talk about how if they eat too much protein, too many amino acids, they come out of ketosis, right? If you eat too much protein, you won't be in ketosis. And that is because all of these amino acids can feed into the TCA cycle, and they can become oxaloacetate. And so the final thing that happens is that the acetyl-CoA gets dumped as ketones by the liver. I showed this graph before, talking about the ratio of acetoacetate to beta-hydroxybutyrate and why that tells us the NADH to NAD plus ratio in the mitochondria. But this is ketone synthesis. As you can see, it starts with 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA. They come down here. They pick up some electrons from NADH on their way to becoming beta-hydroxybutyrate, which, as you saw in the previous graph, is the vast majority of ketones released into the bloodstream are this beta-hydroxybutyrate. And so you're essentially, the liver is flooded with acetyl-CoA and NADH. Those are the things that are inhibiting pyruvate dehydrogenase, and it packs up 2 of these acetyl-CoAs and 1 of these NADH, and it makes beta-hydroxybutyrate, and it dumps it into the bloodstream. Okay, so that's all prologue. Here is the actual magic. This is how we do de novo lipogenesis, and that means making new fat. In the process of de novo lipogenesis, we need pyruvate to be continuously replenishing oxaloacetate so that we can combine acetyl-CoA and oxaloacetate to make citrate. And that citrate is exported from the mitochondria to do DNL. And of course, we just learned that being in ketosis limits oxaloacetate. And if you limit oxaloacetate, you cannot produce enough citrate to do de novo lipogenesis. Now, this is a cool trick, because what happens is fat becomes a one-way street. That PPAR alpha is funneling fat into the mitochondria. That mitochondria is breaking it down into acetyl-CoA and NADH, and then it's just offloading it on the rest of the body as these ketones. There's no way to make those ketones back into fat because there's no oxaloacetate. And so this is essentially a hack that causes fat metabolism to run in one direction, right? The liver is just taking up fat at a very fast rate, and it's being forced to produce these ketones. It's dumping it on the body, and none of the cells can convert those ketones back into fat again. So once the liver does this conversion process, that's it. It's never coming back as fat. And I think that is ultimately the magic of ketosis, and why in some people it can cause incredible fat loss.